"You were never the woman this life required," Graham Whitmore said, his voice low and final as he pushed the divorce papers across the marble table, and the room, 20 floors above Manhattan, felt colder than the winter outside. Naomi Carter didn't argue, didn't plead, she simply looked at the signature line like it had always been waiting for her, because while he saw silence as emptiness, she had spent years learning everything he never noticed, every deal, every pattern, every weakness, hidden behind his perfect empire. And when the crystal glass near her hand tipped and cracked against the table, neither of them reached for it, because something far more fragile had already broken. "You don't even know what you're walking away from," she said quietly, not as a threat, but as a truth he wasn't ready to understand, and for a second, just a second, his jaw tightened like he almost believed her, almost, before dismissing it with a breath. Naomi picked up the pen, signed her name in one smooth motion, slipped off her ring and left it beside the papers like it meant nothing, then turned and walked away without looking back, the sound of her heels steady, certain, disappearing into the hallway, while Graham stayed frozen at the table, staring at a signature he thought was an ending, never realizing it might be the beginning of something he would spend the rest of his life trying, and failing to get back. By the next morning, the penthouse felt too large, too quiet, like the air itself had been stripped of something essential, and Graham Whitmore noticed it not in the obvious places, but in the small fractures that began to surface one after another. His coffee arrived late because no one had adjusted the assistant's schedule after a cancelled breakfast meeting he never remembered canceling. A client call slipped through because a follow-up email had not been sent, and the boardroom presentation he walked into at exactly 9 o'clock stalled within minutes when his senior partner hesitated and asked, "Did Naomi already review these projections?" Because no one else seemed certain they were correct. Graham brushed it off at first, irritation replacing thought, but the pattern continued, subtle, precise, unsettling, like invisible scaffolding had been removed overnight. By noon, his assistant, Claire, stood in his doorway holding a stack of files with a tight expression, explaining that several long-term clients were requesting clarifications Naomi used to handle personally, and when he asked why no one else had stepped in, Claire hesitated just long enough to say the one thing no one had ever said out loud: "She did more than we realized." Something in his chest shifted then, not regret, not yet, but a flicker of awareness that his perfectly controlled world had depended on a silence he had mistaken for absence. Across the city, in a modest office far from glass towers, Naomi sat across from a woman who watched her not with pity, but with sharp interest, listening as Naomi calmly outlined a strategy that solved a problem 3 senior consultants had failed to fix, and for the first time, someone did not overlook her pause before she spoke, but leaned into it. Back in his office, Graham stared at a contract that should have been simple, except it was missing one critical adjustment, one detail no one else seemed able to catch, and for the first time, he found himself asking a question he could not answer. How much of everything he built had actually been held together by the one person he chose to let walk away? The invitation came on a Tuesday afternoon, not wrapped in sympathy, but in opportunity, a quiet email from Elena Brooks asking Naomi to step into a strategy session that 3 senior consultants had already failed to stabilize. And when Naomi walked into the glass conference room, no one looked past her this time, no one dismissed her stillness, because Elena introduced her with a single sentence that shifted the air. "She sees what others miss." And for the next 40 minutes Naomi did not rush, did not perform, she listened, then spoke with precision, pointing out a flaw in the client's positioning that made the entire campaign unstable, and one by one, the executives at the table leaned forward instead of away, their questions no longer skeptical but curious, engaged, almost careful. By the end of the meeting, the client, a man who had interrupted everyone else, turned directly to Naomi and said, "That is the first solution that actually makes sense." And just like that, the room recalibrated around her, not loudly but undeniably. Across the city, Graham sat in his office reviewing a proposal that felt incomplete again. Except this time the gap was not subtle. It was obvious, and when he asked who had handled similar restructures before, his team exchanged looks before someone answered, "No one here," followed by a pause that did not need finishing. Later that evening, a mutual industry contact mentioned a rising consultant who had quietly turned around a failing account in under a week, describing her as calm, exact, impossible to ignore once she spoke, and Graham did not ask the name at first, but something in his chest tightened anyway. Recognition forming before confirmation because the description felt too familiar, too precise, And for the first time the question was no longer what he had lost, but who else was beginning to see it before he ever did. The room shifted before he even stepped inside. A low hum of voices tightening as Graham Whitmore entered the executive conference floor of a client he had never failed before, except today was different, because at the far end of the glass table, seated not beside but across from the decision-makers, was Naomi Carter, and no one introduced her as an assistant or an afterthought. They introduced her as the lead strategist brought in to correct what his firm could not. He paused just for a fraction of a second, long enough for someone else to notice, and in that moment the balance tilted. Naomi did not stand to greet him, did not rush to acknowledge his presence. She simply glanced up once, calm, composed, then returned her attention to the documents in front of her as if he were no longer the center of any room she occupied. The client leaned toward her instead of him, asking for her assessment first, and when she spoke, the table listened, not out of politeness but because they needed her clarity. Graham felt it then, sharp and disorienting, the first undeniable fracture in the narrative he had always believed, because the woman he had dismissed as quiet was now the one everyone deferred to without question. "We adjust the structure or the deal collapses within 90 days, she said evenly, sliding a revised plan forward. And no one challenged her, not even him, because every line was precise, every risk accounted for, every solution already in motion. His colleague shifted beside him, whispering under his breath, "She already stabilized the account before we got here." And something in Graham's chest tightened, not just recognition, but the realization that this was not a sudden change. It was something he had failed to see for years. When their eyes met again, there was no hesitation in hers, no trace of the woman who once waited for his approval, only distance, final and complete. The meeting moved forward around her rhythm now, and for the first time Graham was not leading, not controlling, but trying to catch up to a pace he did not set. And as the client signed off on her proposal, instead of his, the truth settled in with quiet force. He had not just lost her. He had lost his place in a world that now seemed to recognize her value before he ever did. And when the meeting ended, Naomi gathered her papers without looking at him. But the next move was already inevitable, because this was no longer a coincidence, it was a pattern, and the next time they faced each other, there would be no room left to pretend he still understood who she had become. By the end of that week, her impact was no longer a quiet shift inside closed rooms. It had become measurable, visible, and impossible to reroute, because the client that had once been one of Graham's most reliable accounts formally reassigned strategic authority to Naomi's firm, not temporarily, but as a standing directive, and the announcement did not come through whispers. It came through a scheduled board call where her name was stated clearly, deliberately, as the lead who had not only corrected the failing structure but prevented a projected 8-figure loss within 90 days. Graham sat through the call without interrupting, but for the first time in years, his voice was not the one setting the pace, and when he attempted to reframe the narrative, the client cut in with a calm firmness that left no room for interpretation. "We are continuing with her strategy," and the sentence landed heavier than any direct rejection. Across the industry, the shift traveled quickly, not as gossip but as recognition, because people began to reference her work in conversations that no longer included him as the automatic center. And when a senior partner from another firm approached her after a follow-up meeting and asked if she was open to expanding her portfolio, it was done in full view of the same network that once overlooked her entirely. Meanwhile, inside Graham's office, the structure he had always trusted began to show strain, timelines slipped, decisions took longer, and the quiet efficiency he had relied on without naming was now visibly absent, forcing him to step into details he had never needed to manage himself. And with each correction he tried to make, it became clearer that he was no longer operating from control, but from reaction. Late one evening, Claire placed a file on his desk, one he had never seen before, a series of internal notes and strategy drafts that had been routed through Naomi's review months, even years ago, and as he flipped through them, the pattern emerged with unsettling clarity. She had not been supporting his decisions, she had been stabilizing them, correcting them, protecting them from collapsing in ways he had never even noticed, and for a brief moment, the room felt smaller, like something essential had been removed from the foundation of everything he believed he built. He leaned back, staring at a single page marked with her quiet annotations, precise, necessary, invisible at the time, and the question that formed was no longer about her present success, but about his past blindness, because if this was what she had been doing without recognition, then what had he actually been leading, and more importantly, how much of his empire had only stood because she had been there, unseen, holding it together before she finally chose to let it fall. He did not sleep that night, not because of regret, but because the pieces would not stop aligning in ways he could no longer ignore, and by morning, Graham Whitmore was no longer looking at Naomi's absence as a disruption. He was beginning to see it as exposure. The file Claire had left was not a single document, it was a pattern, and once he started opening older archives, emails, strategy drafts, risk assessments, he saw her presence everywhere, not in bold signatures but in quiet corrections, subtle shifts in language, recalibrated projections that had prevented deals from collapsing before they even reached the table. And the deeper he looked, the more unsettling it became, because the timing of his biggest wins no longer felt like his alone. In one folder, he found a rejected proposal he vaguely remembered dismissing years ago, except it had been revised later, restructured with precision, and approved under his name, generating one of the most profitable expansions his company had ever executed. And buried in the metadata, there it was, her work, her adjustments, her restraint, all invisible, all absorbed into his success without acknowledgement. He leaned back slowly, the confidence that once defined him replaced by something unfamiliar, something heavier, because this was not support, this was architecture. And he had never even asked who was building it. Later that afternoon, he called in a senior advisor who had been with the company longer than anyone else, expecting clarification, but instead received confirmation that landed harder than anything else he had uncovered. She saw risks before anyone else did, the man said quietly, and she chose not to take credit, she chose to keep things stable. And that choice, that silence, reframed everything Graham thought he understood about control, about leadership, about himself. Across the city, Naomi was reviewing a new contract with calm focus, her name now printed clearly at the top where it belonged, and for the first time, the work she did could not be redirected or hidden behind someone else's authority. Back in his office, Graham stared at the skyline he once believed he had conquered, but it no longer felt like his, not entirely, because the realization had settled in with quiet certainty. He had not lost a quiet wife. He had lost the one person who had been quietly holding his entire world together, and now that she was gone, the truth was no longer something he could avoid. It was something he had to face. Because if she had been capable of this all along, then what else had she done? What else had she chosen not to reveal? And what would happen if he finally stood in front of her again, this time knowing exactly who she had always been? He did not send flowers, did not call through assistants, did not hide behind formality this time, because Graham Whitmore understood that none of that would reach her anymore. So he showed up in person, unannounced, at the glass office where her name was now etched on the door in clean, deliberate lettering. And for a moment, standing there, he felt something unfamiliar, not hesitation, but the realization that he was no longer walking into a space he controlled. Inside, Naomi Carter was mid-conversation with two senior partners, her voice calm, precise, guiding the room without force, and when the assistant stepped in to inform her that he was waiting, she did not rush, did not react, she simply finished her sentence, closed the meeting on her terms, and only then allowed him to enter. The door shut softly behind him, and for a second, neither of them spoke, the distance between them no longer emotional, but structural, defined by everything that had shifted. "I was wrong," he said first, the words direct, stripped of the certainty he once carried. "I did not understand what you were doing, what you were holding together." And it was the closest he had come to acknowledgement without control, but Naomi did not soften, did not step closer, she remained exactly where she was, composed, grounded in a reality that no longer required his recognition. "You did not ask," she replied quietly, not accusing, just stating a fact that could not be undone. And the simplicity of it landed harder than any argument. He tried again, taking a step forward as if proximity could restore something already gone. "We can fix this, we can start again." But this time she shook her head, not with anger but with clarity. "There is nothing to fix because I am not where you left me." And in that moment the imbalance from before reversed completely, because he was no longer the one deciding the terms. He was asking for access. A knock interrupted them, and the same client who had once deferred to him stepped in, addressing Naomi first, confirming the next phase of their contract, deferring timelines, decisions, authority, all to her, and Graham stood there, watching it happen in real time, the external confirmation making it undeniable. She was not just independent. She was leading at a level he could not reach through her anymore. When the room cleared again, he remained quieter now. I did not know you were carrying all of that. And this time there was no defense left in his voice, only the weight of realization, but Naomi simply met his gaze, steady, distant, and said the one thing he could not argue with. You were not supposed to know, you were supposed to see. And then she stepped past him, opening the door not as an invitation, but as a boundary, a clear signal that whatever connection he thought he could rebuild was no longer his to claim. And as he stood there, unmoving, the truth settled in with final clarity. He could reach for her, he could understand her, but he could no longer have her, and the next time they faced each other, it would not be about rebuilding anything, it would be about accepting what was already gone. The final meeting was not arranged through messages or requests, it happened because their worlds no longer had a choice but to overlap. A private evening reception where investors, partners, and decision-makers gathered under low golden lights, and this time, when Graham Whitmore stepped into the room, he did not search for control, he searched for her. Naomi Carter stood near the center, not performing, not commanding attention, but holding it without effort. And when people approached, they waited for her to finish speaking before they spoke at all, a quiet respect that could not be manufactured. He crossed the room slowly, not with the certainty he once carried, but with the weight of understanding he could no longer ignore, and when she turned toward him, there was no surprise in her expression, only acknowledgement, as if she had already accepted this moment long before he reached it. I know now, he said. His voice lower than before, stripped of its edge. What you were to everything I built, what you were to me. And for a brief second, the noise around them faded, not because the world stopped, but because this was the truth he had never spoken until it was too late. Naomi held his gaze steady, unshaken, and when she answered, her voice carried no anger, only clarity. You did not lose me when I left, you lost me when you decided I was nothing. And the words settled between them with a finality that did not need to be repeated. He stepped closer, just enough to close the distance that had once been his to control. Then let me choose differently now, he said, and for the first time there was no strategy behind it, only a man trying to reach something already gone. Naomi shook her head gently, not rejecting him with force but with truth. You are not choosing me, Graham, you are reacting to who I became after you. And that was the moment. It became undeniable, she was no longer standing inside his story, she had moved beyond it entirely. Around them conversations continued, deals were discussed, but the power had already shifted completely, because he was the one asking, and she was the one deciding, and her decision did not come with hesitation. I do not belong to your past, and I am not part of your future, she said, each word precise, grounded, unchangeable. Something in him stilled then, not from acceptance but from the realization that there was no argument left, no angle, no way to return to what he had broken long before he understood its value. She stepped back first, not as retreat, but as conclusion, and when someone called her name from across the room, she turned toward them without looking back, leaving him standing in a space that once revolved around him, now moving forward without him entirely, and as the distance between them grew, the truth settled with quiet permanence. This was not a moment he could fix, not a loss he could recover from, it was an ending he had already written, and the only thing left was whether he could live with the full weight of what he had finally come to understand. Months later, Naomi Carter no longer moved through rooms as someone proving her place, she moved as someone who had already secured it, her name now spoken in meetings she had never been invited into before, her decisions shaping outcomes that extended far beyond any single deal, and there was a quiet steadiness in the way she carried herself, not guarded, not distant but complete, as if the part of her that once waited to be seen had finally let go of the need entirely. Her firm expanded with intention, not urgency, choosing projects aligned with her standards rather than chasing validation, and when new clients sat across from her, they did not question her presence, they asked for her insight, because the value she brought no longer needed explanation. Across the city, Graham Whitmore stood in the same office that had once felt immovable, but now felt altered in ways he could not reverse, not collapsing, not failing, but no longer anchored in the certainty he once believed was his. Alone, and in quieter moments, he no longer searched for ways to reach her, because he understood that what had been lost was not access, it was something far deeper, something he had never recognized while he still had it. He had learned to identify her work in absence, to see the gaps where her precision once existed, but recognition had come without permission to return, and that distinction settled into him with a kind of stillness that replaced resistance. One evening, He passed by a conference hall where her name was displayed at the entrance, listed among keynote speakers, and for a moment he stopped, not to enter, not to interrupt, but simply to stand outside the threshold of a life that no longer included him, listening to the distant cadence of her voice carrying through the room, steady, assured, no longer shaped by anything he had once defined. There was no anger left in him, no argument waiting to be made, only the quiet understanding that the woman he once reduced to silence had built a world where she no longer needed to be heard by him at all. And as he turned away, leaving the light and sound behind without stepping inside, the truth remained clear and unchangeable. He had finally seen her, completely and without illusion, but he had arrived too late, because she had already become someone who no longer needed to be seen.